There we go. So welcome to this workshop called Selecting a Journal to Publish in. And I'm hoping the next hour and a half that we spend together will be useful for you in your own journey of writing. My name is Adrian. It's good to meet you. I know quite a few of the names that are showing up on the participants list. But if you don't know me, I'm a professor of social work at the University of Johannesburg here in South Africa. And I love writing. And I love talking about writing and developing our writing skills. And last year, I was running a workshop called How to Write a Great Introduction. And a couple of people said, could I give some advice on how to decide where to publish my articles, and particularly whether I should publish in a local journal or an international journal. And so today's workshop is really a response to that request. I'm recording the session, so I will send you the link to the recording afterwards, possibly later today, else tomorrow. And so if you miss out on something, feel free to watch that and you can pick it up. I also want to invite you, if you want to type in the chat, you're very welcome to do that. I'll keep an eye on the screen next to me. And otherwise, you could put up your hand or just talk. So if you have a question or a comment that you want to make as we go along, please feel free to do that, and we'll keep the session quite informal. So here's what we're planning to cover in today's session. It's kind of location, location, location. This is like the mantra of real estate agents. You're trying to set up a business or a company, and you want to sell something. The question is, where do you set up, and where are you going to get people to pass by and to come and buy your products? And it's very much the same with publishing a journal article. You've got to find the best location where you're most likely to draw an audience and get people to read your work. And so I'm going to offer these 10 guidelines or principles, things that we want to think about that help make decisions about where you put your work. This is whether it's international or local. A little pitch for local is lekker. We'll talk a bit about journal requirements, impact factor, lists of journals that you may need to consider, the wait time, which is the time between when you submit and when something gets published, the appropriateness or fit of your article with the journal, the challenge of sugar baby journals. And we'll talk a bit about page fees and open access and the pros and cons of that. So let's jump into that first one, local or international. I think as we're thinking a bit about where to publish your work, you always want to think about who is your primary audience. Who is it that you want to read your work? If your work is internationally relevant or is focused on an international audience, then of course you would like it to be in an international journal. But if you're writing for a local audience within your country or within a particular group, then a local journal would be appropriate. So either option is a good option. I get a bit tired. Some of you come from the global north and others of us, like myself, from the global south. I get quite tired of sort of the trickle down of literature that always comes from the north down to the south, and we in the south tend to be consumers of global north literature, and so often want to flip that around and export from the global south towards the north. And so in my own writing, I publish most of my work in international journals. Some international journals are actually explicitly country-specific, such as the British Journal of Social Work is explicitly a British journal, and so mostly appealing to writers in the UK as well as readers in the UK, but they do, like most international journals, publish papers from other countries. Others, like Qualitative Social Work, is an American journal, but is, in a sense, open to the whole world. So it's not explicitly a US or a British or an Indian or a Norwegian journal. It's just kind of pitches itself as an open journal. And I guess the days of local and international and those divisions have kind of fallen away a bit as we've increasingly moved journals from paper-based to online-based. So I also think you want to think a bit about what we mean by an international journal. Does that just mean a journal that's published in another country? Or does it mean a journal that is deliberately aiming to draw writers from around the globe? And I think the latter is really what we mean by an international journal that explicitly says, we're looking for literature from all over the world and not just from one country. Whereas other journals may be quite regional or local, but are open to other papers and may expect you to speak to how your paper published in or your research done in one country is relevant to people in their country. And then you have to kind of argue your case in a way that you might not have to in other journals. Just a couple of general guidelines, I suppose, about this is that I think it's generally helpful to include the name of your country in the title of your article or in the abstract so that people know quite quickly where is the study located. And again, I think those publishing in the USA generally don't bother about that because they assume, that this is an American journal, American article. But for those of us publishing from elsewhere in the world, it is quite often important to mention your country. And assume an international readership rather than assuming a local readership. You could say the same actually about South Africans publishing in South African journals. It would be helpful to specify that this is in South Africa because many of our readers, in fact, are international. And then lastly, I think it's important just to bear in mind that sometimes publishing in a local journal is a little easier than publishing in an international journal. It's a smaller pool that you are competing against, and so there's a greater likelihood of your work being accepted in a local journal. I normally get my PhD students to do their first publication in a South African journal because this is where we are, a little easier to get there. My own first publication was in a South African journal, and it took a little while before I ventured kind of internationally. So that's the first point. I see some of you typing in your details into the chat. Thanks so much for that. But you'll see I've popped into the chat a registration form. If you could just click on that link, it'll take you to a Google form. Let me show you what that form looks like so that you can just see. Give me half a sec to see if I'm in the right space. Nope, not yet. There we go. There we go. So this is the attendance form. It's a Google form. It just really asks for a couple of details about who you are, what country you're from, if you're studying at another university, and if you're a student, and which workshop you attended. And so if you sometime during the course of today's session would complete that form, I'd be very grateful, and I'll use that to send you the link for the recording as well as a certificate of attendance, which some of you might need. So that's number one. Second consideration is that local is lekker. Now, for those of you who are from South Africa, we know what this term means, but if you're from another country, lekker is an Afrikaans word that is usually used to refer to food that's nice. So nice food, local is lekker. So the idea here with local is lekker is that it is good to publish in local and regional journals and not to obsess too much about trying to get yourself into international journals. Even if your local journal is not as prestigious as some, a British or US journal, it is important to build local capacity and local knowledge. My most cited article, which I put there on the screen, is a critical review of resilience theory and its relevance for social work. It was published in Social Maatskaplike Werk, which is one of the two South African social work journals. It is a local, proudly South African journal. I wrote it for a South African audience, but it is my most cited publication. And so it has reached and is cited by some of the leaders in the resilience field and by people all over the world. And so even though it's in a local journal, it actually has good international traction. And so local is lekker, and building local capacity, I think, is something important for us to give attention to and not always try and kind of go out of country to something else. One of the things that I think that may be useful for you, and I want to encourage you to follow this link. I'm going to pop the link to this article into the chat. Just give me a sec to do that. There we go. Is a publication in the journal that I edit, which is called Social Work Journals, a key disciplinary resource, that was written by Morgan Sternschmidt and Levea in Canada. And what they do in this article is that they pull together a list of all of the social work journals globally, including journals in countries that we might not have easy access to, including journals that are not published in English, including journals that are not on any of the lists, not on the IBSS and Scopus and all those other lists that we are perhaps familiar with. You can download this article for free from the link that I put into the chat. And I think that this is a really useful resource for those of us who are social workers. And I'm mindful that not everybody here is necessarily a social worker. So my apologies for kind of just assuming that you're all social workers. I'm just kind of immersed in my discipline. But if you are publishing for social work, I think it's worth having this list and looking at the journals that are available here. They've really done something exceptional in putting together a very comprehensive and global list of social work journals. So that's number 2. Don't be shy of publishing locally. Ultimately, what will determine the success of your article is not so much where you publish it, as much as the quality of what you're publishing. So the quality of what you publish is really a main key decisive factor in the reach that your work has. But at the same time, you do want to be considering access to that piece of research. And so how accessible is that journal? Good. Next, third point for us to consider is about the journal requirements. It is really, really important to study the journal website that you're considering for your article and ensure that your article complies with all of those requirements. And I know in my journal, quite often we have a 7,000 word limit on articles, and regularly we'll get articles that are 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 words long. And we have to decline it right at the beginning before we go anywhere, because they just haven't followed the rules on our website. So the kinds of things that you want to look for and pay attention to are things like, what is the word count? So many journals will tell you that they have a limit of so many words. They will also tell you whether that word count includes or excludes your reference list. And again, your reference list can run into thousands of words, so you want to think about that. Others will give you a page count, but then they will set margins, font size, line spacing, all of those kinds of things. Journals will also tell you what referencing format they want. In social work, most journals are using the APA referencing style. Some journals, you will see from the way they describe the journal that they're actually looking for large data sets. They want big data, and so they won't accept an article that's got 9 or 12 participants, a sort of a small qualitative study. You want to kind of look towards that. Some journals have a strong quantitative bias, and they're not particularly interested in qualitative research. Some journals have a more practice orientation, but that's kind of in a sense what they're focused on is about practice, whereas others are quite theory intensive, like sociology journals tend to be quite theory intensive, and some social work journals have quite a strong practice orientation. So I want to show you just as an illustration, let me just get back to my website here. This is the journal website for the journal that I edit, Southern African Journal of Social Work and Social Development. And what you'd be looking for, each journal has its own language and layout, but in this case, you would go to About, and there you see a link for About the journal. And if you go onto that page, you will start to see information about the journal that would guide you as to whether your article is suitable for this journal. So let's have a quick run through a couple of points. The purpose of this journal is to promote and stimulate research and innovation that empowers individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities to advocate for and advance sustainable development and human well-being. And that opening sentence already tells you something about what this journal is about and what would be suitable and what would not be suitable. You see words like socially just, rights-based, humane. Again, it gives you a sense of what the journal's focus is. And you see that we say both locally and internationally, right? So there's an opening there for anybody, but with a particular focus on the Southern African region. You'll see that there is quite a strong emphasis, the whole paragraph here about research ethics and particularly about the ethics of care. And so that'll cue you that this journal is particularly interested in ethics. So if you submit an article to our journal and you don't have a section on ethics, we're going to send it back to you because ethics is really important for us. You'll also see here a description around what kinds of manuscripts might be suitable and what are not. So we've mapped out some of those, but I just want to mention here point number 3. So we will accept systematic or scoping reviews that provide new insights or new answers to new research questions, but we would not consider a literature review. And quite often people would take their literature review from their dissertation and send that to us as an article, and then we decline it immediately because we will not publish just a literature review. And we provide a list of the kinds of topics so that you have a sense of what is it that we're interested in, and so on and so forth. So most journals will have a section around the aim and scope of the journal, and these are the kinds of things that you want to have a bit of a look at as you're deciding where you want to publish. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. I'm not seeing any questions coming up there, but just a reminder that if you do want to ask some questions, you're welcome to put that in the chat, or otherwise just put your mic on and speak out loud, and I'll take your question. Just a couple of other points around the journal requirements. If you have a very long article, so sometimes you'll have a journal article that's heading towards 10,000 words. Don't send it to a journal that has a 5,000 word limit, because you really are wasting your time. They will reject it immediately, but immediately often may take a few weeks for it to get through the desktop review process, and so you will have lost time. So make sure that your article complies with the journal requirements, otherwise you're likely to be turned down. There are some journals that have no word limits. Children and Youth Services Review, for example, does not have a word limit. And so you could get away with publishing a 14,000 word article there. I've done that with a group of people, and we got it published. So there are a handful, not many, but there are a handful of journals that will take quite long papers and may not have a word restriction at all. But most journals are sitting around the 7,000 word limit. I generally, in my own writing, and I encourage my colleagues and students to do this, is when you start to prepare writing an article, begin to think immediately about where you would publish it and write your article for a particular journal. Make sure that you do that. The worst thing is to write a 9,000 word article and then to pick a journal that has a 6,000 word limit and you have to cut 3,000 words. It's very painful. You lose a lot of time and it can be quite demoralizing to cut. So make those decisions in front and then write for that length and write for that referencing style and for the requirements of your journal. Okay, let's move on to our next point. Impact factor number 4. Impact factors, they have become all the rage, and some universities require you to have particularly high impact factor journals and to really make that a key part of what you look at. So these things will vary from institution to institution. Some place an emphasis on it, others not so much. My university doesn't worry too much about impact factor, but other universities really do. So you need to just check out what is the expectations of your institution. The impact factor and what's also sometimes called the citation score indicate roughly, if we just sort of talk roughly speaking, they indicate how many publications how many citations each publication gets over a set period of time. So it's the average number of citations, that's when somebody else cites your work and they're writing, per paper over a period of time. And that period of time can be 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. It kind of varies from measure to measure. So, for example, if the impact factor is 2, what that means in effect, roughly, is that each article that gets published gets cited twice on average. That means some articles don't get any citations, some get 1, sometimes some may get 4 or 5, but on average, each article gets cited twice. And that's not, I mean, that's not hugely spectacular, right? 2 citations, 2 people read and used each person's work. That's really quite a low score, but that's what an impact factor of 2 means. Now, the impact factor comes from a company called Clarivat, and their impact factor is defined as the yearly mean number of citations, so the average number of citations of articles published in the last 2 years in a given journal. So that's publications 2 years after publication.
Did you go for 10 again?
Hi,
Can you go
Noor.
for 10 again?
Noor, I'm going to mute you, I think. Thank you. The site score, which is produced by Scopus, is a similar definition, but just a different time period. So they have the number of citations received by a journal in the last 4 years, divided by the number of documents published in those journals over those 4 years. So again, it's the average number of citations over a set period of time, in this case, 4 years, whereas the impact factor is over 2 years. And you could follow this link that's down here at the bottom to get to some of the metrics for international social work. Now, I'm just trying to remind myself if I have that on screen. I do. So I'm going to just quickly share that with you. So if we go, for example, to international social work, we'll see that they have a section on their website called Journal Indexing and Metrics. And in fact, international social work has really gone to town with providing every possible metric. So the journal citation reports, if we open that up, gives you a 2-year impact factor and a 5-year impact factor. And what we see here, for example, with the 2 years is 2.2. That means 2.2 citations in the 2 years after publication on average per article. The 5-year impact factor, which you would have thought would be higher, is actually a bit lower, 1.9. What that suggests is that the more recent publications have been cited more and older publications perhaps not so much. And they give you a whole bunch of different metrics that you can read through. They also give you the Scopus scores, which is quite similar. The site score here is 4.3, so you can see quite a wide difference in the kinds of metrics that these things generate. And they also give you a bit of a Google Scholar set of metrics. So you can go, it's a bit like a rabbit hole. You can go down the rabbit hole in looking at impact factors to see which ones you're going to go with. What I'm going to present to you on this page over here, this comes off Scopus, and these are the journals in Scopus that have the word social work in the title. So this would exclude a journal that does not specifically say social work. So children and youth services review, for example, would not appear in this particular list. But what I want you to notice is that the journal with the word social work in it that has the highest site score is clinical social work with a score of 4.6. And so that, in a sense, is about the highest site score that you're going to get in a journal. And you'll see that we move quite quickly down from 4.6 into the 3s. And next thing, before you know it, we're down in the 2s. If we were to go a little further down this list, you'll see that some have a score of 0 and some don't have any score at all. So there are 12 journal articles in the Scopus list that don't have any citation site score at all. But the other, for those who do have a score, the scores range from 0.2 for the Indian Journal of Social Work to 4.6 for clinical social work, and the median score is 2.0. So if you're publishing within the social work field, any journal that has a site score above 2 is one of the stronger journals in terms of citations. And so that would probably almost always be a good choice. But I do want to just remind you that in my opinion, the impact factor of the journal is not the decisive factor about how well your article will do. The decisive factor about how well your article will do is the quality of your article. So that article that I showed you earlier of mine that has 620 something citations was published in a journal that has a site score of 0.9. 0.9. So on average, each article in that journal gets cited once. Mine has got cited 621 times. It's not because the journal was a great or a weak journal, it was because it was a good article, in my humble opinion. It was a good article that spoke to the audience and was in an open access journal. We'll talk about that a little bit just now. So you may want to go into Scopus and access this list of journals and give that some thought as you're thinking a bit about where you want to publish your work. One of the frustrations is that in the lists you can search lists by topic or by field rather, and social work is never included as a field in those lists. They'll have sociology and anthropology and development studies, but very seldom do they actually have social work. I see a question in the chat, so let me go to that quickly. Can you please drop the link to the Scopus page? I'll definitely do that. You will need to have access to Scopus. So you can see it here on my screen, there's a little institution there, and the AB means, that's my initials, Adrian van Breda. So you might need institutional access through your university library to get into Scopus. But that link should kind of get you there. And then when you search, you're going to click here on sources at the top of the top right page, you see on my screen, and sources will then take you to all of the lists of journals that are on the Scopus database. All right, let me get you back to PowerPoint slides. There we go. I guess what I want to say as a sort of summary about impact factor is that I think that impact factor is important if it's important to your institution. So go check with your institution what they're expecting. If they're looking for high impact factor journals, then that would be something that you would want to try to comply with, because that's what's going to help you get ahead academically in your career. But if there isn't a particular push for that, rather find the journal that is the most suitable for what you want to publish, and don't worry too much about impact factor. I personally don't worry excessively about impact factor. I worry more about the quality of my writing. Okay, point number 5, we're kind of the halfway mark. So again, just want to invite you, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise those. And I'm going to just pop into the chat again the link for the attendance register. Please do sign the register. It will help me give you the link to the recording and the certificate of attendance, which may or may not be useful to you. It's also useful for me because one of our key performance indicators at the University of Johannesburg is the number of people that we reach through these kinds of international workshops. And so you'll be helping me with my performance indicators by signing up, or not by signing up, by registering, not registering either, by filling in the attendance list. We'll get there eventually. Okay. Lists, oh my word. Mesagan, the attendance register is the link just above where you've posted. Okay, so if you look just above it, there's a link there to forms.gle, and that's the form, right? It'll take you to a Google form, and the Google form will ask you just a few pieces of information about yourself. So there's another question here from Stefan before I go to lists. Would I say that there is a correlation between the impact factor of the journal and the rank of the lists, high to low? Yeah, I think that does play a list, Stefan. I think so. World of Science, for example, is kind of one of the highest, sort of most exclusive lists of journals. Scopus is perhaps a kind of a mid one, and the DOAJ, which is the the Directory of Open Access Journals, I think is what it stands for, is probably a little bit lower, right? And the DOHIT list, if there's a journal, I mean, the DOHIT list, I think, is now a fairly short list compared to where it was 10 years ago. For those of you who are not South African, the DOHIT list is a Department of Higher Education and Training list that's put out by the government of South African journals that are accredited in South Africa, but many of them are not listed on any of the international lists like Scopus and World of Science and IBSS. And the number of those journals has got less and less, and so they're probably, the least reputable journals in a sense. They're very, very local. There may be emerging journals as well. So, when you're starting off, it takes a while. So our journal that I published, Southern African Journal of Social Work and Social Development, was a DOHIT journal for many, many years and got listed on Scopus 3 or 4 years ago, so fairly recently, that we managed to get onto Scopus. And we spent about 5 years trying to meet Scopus's requirements and get on their list. So yes, when you do go through, particularly the South Africans, if you do go through those lists that we get from Department of Higher Education and Training, World of Science be a really would be a really good list. IBSS, also a really good list. Scopus, next in line. DOAJ, next, and then DOHIT, in a sense, not undesirable, but the least well-ranked. Nico, can I get, do you want to open? There we go, great.
Hi, Prof. I just wanted to ask, is there a way to convince whoever it may be to add a journal to the Department of Higher Education's list? Because then it's sort of, well, in this particular case, it's a bit unfair that it's been excluded. So is there like a process you can sort of try to convince them to add it on?
So a journal that's not listed on DOHIT, on the DOHIT list.
Yes.
So, I mean, this would then most usually be a new journal. DOHIT will have various requirements. I must say, when I took over the editorship, we were already on the DOHIT list. But what DOHIT's going to be looking at is the quality of the review process. That's going to be the main thing. They want to make sure that there are double-blind reviews, that there's at least two reviewers of each manuscript, that there's an editorial process, that there's an editorial board providing oversight to what the editor's doing, and so on. And so those are the kinds of things that DOHIT looks for. And I know periodically, I think every 3 or 4 years, DOHIT requires all of us, our journal included, even though we're now on Scopus, we have to submit a report. And these are the kinds of questions that they're asking for. They're also trying to make sure, for example, that you don't have an issue with 6 articles and they all come from the University of Johannesburg. We call those sweetie pie journals. And so in a sense, it's like friends publishing friends' work, and it implies that the quality assurance process is not strong. And so they'll be looking for these kinds of quality assurance things. I'm not sure who at DOHIT you would speak to. You may want to chat, if you're at university, with your library, find your person in charge of your library, and they'll probably be able to hook you up with the right people at DOHIT for the journal accreditation. Nico, I hope that helps a bit. And
I'm from UJ, so I'll speak to our people.
Great stuff. Yeah, always, it's exciting to get a new journal off the ground. I see there's a few other questions, so I'm going to just pause and take these questions from the chat. So Sandra's asking, I want to know the importance of publishing to a discipline-specific journal and the disadvantage of publishing in a multidisciplinary journal. Okay, that's a great question. I think if you've got a journal that's specific to your discipline, my discipline is social work. So if you go with an explicitly social work journal, you're going to get people reading your article that are in your field, that'll be familiar with your field, that will be knowing what we kind of expect from a journal within that discipline. When you publish in a multidisciplinary journal, you have a multidisciplinary readership, and people from other disciplines may expect different things. And let me give you an example between social work and sociology. We have a lot in common with each other. But social work tends to be more applied. And so quite often what we publish in social work are empirical pieces where there's not a great deal of theorization, but there is a good kind of interrogation of the data and what the data means and what it means for practice. A sociology journal will not be looking for so much stuff on practice, but they'll be looking for really rigorous theorization, more than what most social workers do. I mean, there are great social workers who do a lot of theory, but many of us don't. So if you're going for an interdisciplinary journal and your paper is a bit more on the practice side and just kind of working with the data that you have, you may find it harder to get published than if you were to go into a social work journal, because people will be looking for different things. The upside of publishing in a multidisciplinary journal is that there's a wider readership, right? And so there's perhaps more people are likely to read your article, and so likely that you'll get more citations. And for many of us, the citations are quite important because we don't just write to write, but we write to get read. And when someone's read our work, we want them to cite our work. And that's in a sense how we know that our work is valuable. So there's kind of pros and cons of weighing all of that up. And I think in a sense, you want to kind of evaluate each article against the journal requirements to see, is this a good fit for my journal? So I hope that helps a bit. Rolf's asking, would you say that publishing in a higher ranked journal that is not on the DOHIT list is better than a journal on the list. So, let me just check, read this again. Would you say that publishing in a higher ranked journal that is not on the DOHED list? So, Rolf, let's just clarify. There's the DOHED list, which is just the DOHED journals, and most of the DOHED journals are not listed anywhere else. And then there's the other lists, so the IBSS and World of Science and Open Access and the Norwegian lists and so on. I think that if it is on one of those international lists, then it's likely that those journals are more robust in terms of their quality and sort of international standing. If an article's only appearing on the DOHED list, it really means that it's a very local journal and the audience is likely to be a South African audience and nobody beyond that. And so I would generally go with a higher ranked journal.
Yeah. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Rolf.
Sorry, now when I look at my comment, it doesn't actually really say what I wanted it to say. What I was referring to is at our universities, you will know that we need to publish in certain, or the expectation is that you publish in certain journals where you will get subsidy for.
Yes.
However, sometimes a good journal where you can probably get good citations is not on any of those lists.
Yes.
So my question is, especially considering NRF grading and those kind of things, would it sometimes be better to write a paper for a journal that you will not get university subsidy, but for your own personal grading, it might be actually a better proposition to publish in those journals?
Thanks, Rolf. That would have been hard to type into a sentence. That's a really great question and a really good point. So let's summarize. So in South Africa, for those of you who are not from South Africa, we have this list of journals that we are, that if we publish in one of those journals, the government, Department of Higher Education and Training, provides a financial subsidy to the university, and it's one of the sources of income for universities. Most universities will give a cut of that income to the author. And so this is where we as individuals get some of our research funds, is from our publications. I know that in many countries that's not true. It's a nice incentive and it enables us to do research. So yes, if you publish in a journal that's not on the list, you will lose the subsidy. In my university, they won't, for like my performance rating, they won't consider that as a valid publication at all. So effectively, it's like it's been thrown away. However, I do sometimes, and I know colleagues do sometimes, choose to publish in a non-accredited journal because that journal may be very niche. There may be a special issue and you want your work to be, you want to be part of that special issue where you're contributing to that. So there may be some sort of disciplinary or subject-related incentive for you to be part of that thing, and then you choose to publish because you wanted to end that, or in a book, for example, that you might know might not be accredited. And I think that that's a thoughtful decision, that you want to kind of go in and weigh up the advantages and disadvantages and then make a decision for yourself. My general advice is that if you are a new academic and you're still building up your academic profile, you can't really afford to do that at this stage of your career. So if you're in the first few years of your academic career and you're building up your publications, my advice generally would be go with one of the accredited journals, because you need to build up that sort of profile. Once you have, a couple, 10, 20, 30 publications, you can afford to publish in a journal where there's another motivation other than subsidy. And there you may want to look at the impact factor rather than the list to guide you on that. I hope that helps, Rolf. It's a subtle question.
Thank you so much. It does.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for that. There's one last question, then I'm going to move on to the topic that's on screen, which is lists. Please talk a bit about how best to detect and avoid predatory journals. It seems hard for many people. Well, I might be wrong. Firminous, thank you for that question. I agree with you. I think it is very hard to judge what is predatory and what is not. And I see sometimes when people's research portfolios are being evaluated, for example, for the National Research Foundation, which again is a South African thing where we review the quality of the research output of an individual, are these journals predatory or not? So one of the things that one can look at is Beale's list, and I'm going to pop that into the chat there. So Beale is I think is the name of a person. Predatory journals. So I'll pop that into the chat. So you can Google Beale's list. And what Beale tries to do is to evaluate the extent to which journals can be considered predatory. There are some journals that are on these lists that we've talked about, the ones that you can see on screen now, Scopus, IBS's World of Science, and so on. They're on those lists, but they are still regarded as predatory. And if you follow on the media, you will periodically see well-established publishing houses pulling journals and entire issues and all of the articles that go with it off their journal website because they've been produced by, what do they call them, a journal mill. It's like a artificial intelligence that's just like churning out fake journal articles, and the review process has not been properly followed, and rubbish junk faked articles are being published. And these are sometimes in journals that are on these lists. So how do you judge them? I think one of the things that is worth looking at is to read some of the articles that are published in that journal that you're looking at and see whether you would judge them to be good quality journal articles. So apply your own mind. If the articles in the journal you're looking at are not well written and are not innovative and are not showing something original and are not well substantiated, that might be a journal that you want to avoid because it suggests that the review process might not be rigorous, and that your journal might later on be accused of being in a predatory journal, even if your article is legitimate. You may also want to look at things like the turnaround times. And we'll talk just now about the wait time. So in a sense, this is the opposite. If the journal is too quick to publish, that's usually a warning sign. I get a lot of invitations. Please submit your article to our journal on gynecology or dentistry. Nothing to do with me. If we get your journal by Friday, we'll have it published by next week. And literally, I get these kinds of emails frequently. That's obviously not legitimate, right? So we stay away from that journal. We avoid those journals. It's a bit of a judgment because it's quite hard to know, oh, this is definitely predatory and this is definitely not. And so you kind of have to apply your mind. Beale's list is a helpful list to consult because it does give you some point of reference that's not just your own opinion. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. So we've kind of jumped into quite a bit of what I actually wanted to say here under lists, and that is essentially that some countries and some universities may have lists of journals that your university or institution expects you to publish in. And so, thanks, Feminist. So if that's true, then you want to follow, generally speaking, your university's requirements in terms of where to publish your work. If they're saying they must be in journals with an impact factor above 2, then try to comply with that. If they're saying it must be on the World of Science list, then try to comply with that. Notwithstanding what I was just saying to Rolf about kind of exercising your judgment, as a general rule of thumb, try to follow what your institution is arguing. South Africa has a fairly comprehensive list of journals. They include World of Science, IBSS, Scopus, the Norwegian list, the journals, the open access journals, and I think 1 or 2 other lists. And so there's quite a good range. There's really hundreds and hundreds of journals there that you could choose from that would generate a subsidy and would meet your university's requirements. So as a rule of thumb, I would suggest that you follow those. just be aware that when you publish outside of those lists, there may be long-term consequences for your academic progression. And particularly if you're an emerging scholar, so if you're fairly new in academia, still in your first 3 to 5 years as an academic, if you build up a pattern of publishing in journals that are not on these lists, you could compromise your promotion opportunities, you could compromise your performance reviews on an annual basis, your opportunity for promotion and for other jobs, if you apply for jobs elsewhere, could be compromised. NRF, the National Research Foundation that does ratings, would take those into considerations, and reviewers are explicitly asked to look for predatory journals. And so you want to think carefully about where you put your work to make sure that it's in a reputable forum. And of course, defining what reputable is a judgment. If you're uncertain, I would suggest consult with a more senior colleague of yours, someone who has a longer publication, someone in your discipline, and find out from them what the requirements are. All right, the next item on our list, we're moving on to point 6 of the 10 points that we have, is wait time. So wait time refers to, it varies a little bit, but it refers to the time between when you submit your article to a journal and when it gets fully published. That's the wait time. And that wait time is generally at least 6 months and could be up to a year or even 5 years. So I published an article with International Journal of Social Work, and there was a 5-year wait from the time the journal was accepted and when it was actually published in issue. 5 years. And for those of you in South Africa will know, you can't submit your article for subsidy or anything until it's fully published. So it was a very, very, very long, frustrating wait for me. So I always encourage myself and my colleagues and students, and I want to encourage you to go and check out the wait time when you're trying to select a journal. And I think most people don't know about this. And so that's why I'm doing this kind of at the midpoint in today's workshop. If you've stuck around long enough, then you get this special once-off, kind of opportunity. So when you look on a website of a journal, I'm going to give you some examples in a moment, they will quite often give you something called time to first decision. Time to first decision. And the first decision you might think means, oh, that's the decision that comes back after my article's been out for review, but actually it's not. The first decision is a decision that the editor makes based on a desktop scan of your article that the editor will do to determine whether your article complies with the journal's aim and scope and requirements. So that's really just, is this article relevant to our journal? Is it within the right word count? Does it look broadly okay? And that may take an editor 10 minutes or 15 minutes to do. It's a quick scan. And that is quite often done within a day or a week. It really means nothing. All it means is that they're going to send your article out on review or not. And so don't be misled when it says 6 days, that somehow you're going to get a reviewer feedback within 6 days. That's not what it means. It means how long is the editor going to take to decide whether your article is going to go out on review. So what you want to have a look is this material that's on the right that's under the little icon that says speed and acceptance. So some journals, not all journals, will have this information on their website where they give the time data. So this particular journal, I can't remember where this comes from, says that it takes 146 days, that's about 5 months, right? On average, from submission to first decision. Now, I imagine that in this case, first decision probably means the first feedback from a reviewer, because if it's taking 146 days for the editor to decide whether the article might be suitable and whether they're going to send it out on review, then you don't want to go to that journal because it's spending 5 months doing nothing. Then they have 70 days on average from the acceptance to online publication. And what happens in that period of time generally is the editing or the editing, so quite often copy editing, some journals do copy editing, not all, to check your language, spelling, grammar, etc., as well as to get the article formatted into the journal requirement, right? So that it looks not like your Word document, but looks like the article itself. So you're looking there at 2 to 3 months, right? For them to get it ready for online publication. And then they also provide an acceptance rate. And the kind of rule of thumb around acceptance rate is the lower the acceptance rate, the better the journal, right? So the more articles a journal rejects, the better quality the journal, because it's seen as everybody wants to publish there and they're only taking the very, very best. And so you have a low acceptance rate. So that's one of the things that you can look at. Not all journals have this information, but some do. It's worth having a careful look at that to get a sense of how long is this going to take. The other thing that you can check is on an actual article. So you can access a recently published article, and on the first page or at the last page, that's usually the first or the last page, you'll find this kind of information here that gives you the date the article was received, when it was revised, when it was accepted, and when it was published. So if you look at this one, this is scarily fast, right? The article was received on the 10th of January. It was revised on the 4th of February, which is 3 weeks later. 2 days later, it was accepted, and 2 days after that, it was fully published. We're looking at less than a month between submission and publication. And to me, that suggests a not rigorous process, unless the article was mind-blowingly fast. But even then, that's a bit frighteningly fast. So that can be quite useful information, and some journals will publish that on the actual articles. Generally, I want to advise you, don't write to an editor up front and say, how long is it going to take to get an article published? I need to get something published quickly for my thesis. When I get those articles, I get really annoyed because it's like, it will take as long as it takes. It depends on the quality of your article. It depends on the availability of reviewers, depends on how quickly reviewers reply, depends on my workload. You know, we do all of this for free. And so try not to be putting pressure on editors up front in that kind of way. Rather go do your homework and look on the journal's website. So don't pressure editors because you want something quick. So let me have a quick look. There's a couple of questions here, and then we're going to talk a bit more about how you can assess the wait time. So Nico's asking, doesn't a long wait time like 5 years weaken the reliability of one's work since it has aged? Yeah, it certainly does. But the upside is that with online publishing, which has become almost universal now, and this is really only in the last, five years or so, almost all journals will publish your article online as soon as it's accepted. Then it may take a year or 2 or 5 before it actually gets into an issue, but it's still sitting on the journal's website. It can be downloaded and it can be cited just like any other article. And so, in fact, it's used, and by the time it gets published, you might already have 30 citations. It's just that it's taken a while to actually get into an issue. No, it's not like it's going to just be sitting at the bottom of somebody's cupboard for 5 years. It will be online. So that article I referred to with International Social Work, it was published online, and then it sat as an online publication for about 5 years before it actually got into a volume and an issue. And so that was the wait time. And in South Africa, you can only submit it for subsidy. And in our university, you can only submit it for a performance review once it's actually published in the journal. Right, it's got to be in an issue. Ruby's asking, that can be really frustrating. It could take almost a year for them to get back to you. But if the article has to be edited, then they want to back in a couple of weeks, Ruby. It's a power game, isn't it? Yes, journals will move at their own pace, and authors have to reply really, really quickly. I'm an editor of a journal, and I can say to you that something happened in COVID and post-COVID, that there is just a massive number of articles coming in. And I know this because from many editors in different parts of the world that I've spoken to, we have just a deluge of articles that come into us. And we find it very, very hard to get reviewers to agree to review, and once they agree to review, to actually deliver. And so the review process has become a real challenge. We struggle just to get people to agree, and then once they agree, we struggle to get them to deliver. And I don't quite know what's happened, but something's shifted, because it was not like this before COVID, and it really feels like this post-COVID. So something shifted in the world in COVID. Yeah, I know in my journal, we try to be very respectful and compassionate towards both reviewers and authors around turnaround times. So we'll keep pushing people, but we also recognize that you have lives and that things happen. And so we try to sort of find a balance between pressure and grace, I suppose. Maru says, post-star education without doing PhD, is it possible to write a journal article and you're not necessarily in academia? For instance, as a teacher, I decided to publish. Is that possible? Absolutely. There is, people often think that you have to be a professor or a lecturer before you can publish. That's absolutely not the case. If you have dropped out of school a couple of years before finishing school, and you're able to do a good piece of research and write a good article, you can submit that. There's absolutely no criteria to say you have to be a professor, or you have to have a PhD, or you have to have some degree or anything. There's absolutely no requirement. The journal article is evaluated entirely based on the journal article. The only person who will know, in most journals, we use what's called a double-blind review, and that means that you don't know who reviewed your article, but the reviewers don't know who wrote the article. Now, that's not true of all journals, but it is true of most journals. It's called double-blind. And what that means is that the person who's reviewing your article has no idea who you are. And so they can't be influenced by the fact that you're some international brilliant guru, or you're a teacher teaching at primary school. They can't see that. All they have is your article, and they're going to evaluate the article on its merit, not on who you are, not on your demographic or your education or anything. So absolutely, we have really no interest in who you are. We're just interested in your work. And so if your work is great, we'll take it. And if you're a super duper professor and you write a piece of rubbish, we'll reject it. So we're quite neutral in that. I hope that encourages you, Mari. Don't be shy. Go for it. Thanks to Lani. That's great. I'm just going to check quickly if there's any questions to answer. Isn't it advisable to do a PhD through articles? Yes. Sadi, we have different views on this, but my own view is I try to get all my PhD students to do their thesis by articles, and to try and get at least one of those articles through the publication process early. So get something written early and then have others that are in review. Particularly if you're wanting to move into the academy, if you want to become a lecturer, it would mean that by the time you get your PhD, you already have publications, and so you already have a much better chance of getting into the academy. Or if you are already like a lecturer and you wanted to get promoted, what you want is by the time you get your PhD, you have your PhD plus a couple of publications already, and you can immediately be promoted to senior lecturer. So yes, definitely as a general rule of thumb, PhD by articles, in my opinion, is the way to go. And most of my PhD students are doing that. Stephen is saying, I'm informed in the University of Johannesburg there are some publication requirements from your thesis before submission. Yes, so if you do your thesis by articles, you will automatically meet the criteria of the university at UJ, right? If you do a traditional thesis, just the long kind of book-like document, what UJ requires is that you must produce for a PhD 2 manuscripts, so 2 article manuscripts. They don't have to be submitted, but they do have to be ready for submission. That's the UJ requirement. So if you do a traditional thesis, just the big long book, right, then you've got to submit that. And in addition, you've got to submit 2 article manuscripts, which you can, of course, extract from your thesis, but you've still got to write them up as articles. And that's why if you do your PhD by articles, as Sadi's suggesting, The advantage is that you will already have 4 manuscripts in your thesis, so you don't have to do anything more. When you submit your thesis, the manuscripts are packaged in and you don't have to do anything else. And so that makes things a little easier. So I hope that's clearer. There's a follow-up from you. What then are the steps required to do a PhD by articles? Talk to your supervisor and see if you can sell the idea to them. UJ has a policy on PhD by articles and masters by articles. And so it's increasingly internationally and at UJ certainly increasingly used, and some universities do this as their default. So you would need to take it up with your supervisor, because if your PhD is currently registered as a sort of traditional PhD, they may need to submit a request to convert it into PhD by articles. And your supervisor, because it varies from faculty to faculty, should be able to guide you a bit on that. Thanks, Stephen. Good. Thanks, colleagues. Let's then move on to, I want to show you just a little bit about how to try and assess the wait time that an article may face, because quite often journals don't provide the information, and even if they do, what they're giving you is average times, and you almost want to see what's the real wait time. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk this through very quickly, and then I'm going to show you an example on a journal. So you want to check the backlog of publications. So as I mentioned earlier, journals now are publishing articles online, but then they have to wait a little while before they actually get put into a volume and an issue, right? So they'll be sitting accepted, fully accepted, published. They look like a proper article. You can cite them, everything, but they're not yet in a volume or issue. And they can sit there for years. And so let me show you this example. This is a journal called Childcare in Practice. I submitted an article to them a couple of years ago, and I had not properly, I'm normally very careful about this, but I had not properly checked. And sometime later, I realized this article is going to take 3 to 4 years before it actually gets published fully. And I was a bit disappointed about that. So let me quickly show you here. So this is a journal called Childcare in Practice. This is a good journal. There's nothing wrong with the journal. It just has quite a long wait time. So I want to show you using this as an example. Now, each journal will look a little different, and you'll need to kind of apply your mind to go and search for it. It's a bit like being a detective. You need to go and look and see what's happening. Well, what you want to find is something that's called advanced publications or early publications or early view. In this journal, if you look here where it says browse all articles and issues, there's a link there called latest articles, and that's where you'll find articles that have been published online but are not yet in an issue. So if I go to this page, then here I see latest articles are articles that have been accepted for publication, but not yet published in an issue or a volume. Now that means they can still be read, they can still be cited, they're out in the public domain, people can use them, but sometimes within your institution, you might not be able to submit them, for example, for promotion or NRF rating or subsidy and so on. How do you find out how many articles are waiting to be published? You would scroll down and you would add up all of these articles. Now, unfortunately, most journals will not tell you how many articles in this list. This one just says there's 2 pages. So a quick way to do that is just to search for the word article, because we see that each article is the heading article there at the top. If we go back to the top, we'll see there's a bunch of articles showing up here in the search that I've done there. In fact, I know because I've done this before, there's 15 uses of the word articles outside of the list. And if you look at the top here, you'll see that there are 68 articles in this list. Minus 15 means, what is the sum there? 53, right? So 53 articles that have been accepted are available online, but not yet published. That's just on the first page. If we go to the second page and we repeat that search, there's another 26 minus 15, so another 11, right? So we're looking at 60, 70 articles that are waiting to be published, that have been accepted, are online, but not yet published. 70 articles. So now the question is, how many articles does the journal actually publish per year? Right? If they publish 70 a year, then that's great because it'll get published within 12 months. So what we then do is that we go to a recent issue. So I'm going to go here to current issue. And I'm going to just count up how many articles are in this issue. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 articles in this issue. I would normally go and check a few more to try and kind of see, is 9 the normal number, right? So quite often journals have like a set number of articles per issue. And in this particular case, it's about that. And what that means is it's going to take a good 7 or 8 issues before my article gets published, bearing in mind my article's actually been there for a few years already. And the next thing you would do is how many issues do they publish a year? 23, they published 4 issues. In 2022, they published 4 issues. So what they're doing is they're publishing about 40 articles a year. And that means I have another 2 years before my article is going to be published, even though I submitted it 3 years ago that it was published online. A long wait. And if you can't afford the long wait, then you want to not go to that journal, right? So yeah, sometimes I have to do a bit of detective work and do that before you submit your article. Go and look at the wait list and see if that's okay. Yes, so I'm thinking that that article of mine might get published next year. Because the articles are published online, they can be cited, and I do already have citations from that article, so it's not the end of the world, and I have other articles, so I'm okay, but it does put a bit of pressure on you. All right, that's the wait time. Let's move on to our next point. All right, we're heading into the last piece of today. We've got about 20 minutes left. So appropriateness and fit, this is quite a quick piece. You want to make sure that your journal, that your article fits with this aim and the scope of the journal. If the journal is a social work journal, but you're writing something from anthropology, that might not be an appropriate journal for you to go to. If the journal is about aging and you're doing research on youth, it's not an appropriate journal. I mean, some of this is kind of just obvious, but there are often more subtle nuances around what the journal is interested in that's beyond just the title of the journal or the stated aim and scope. And so one of the things that is quite useful is to look at the editors and the editorial board members. And if you look at the editors and you look at what they're publishing, and if you look at the editorial board members and what they're publishing, that may give you a bit of a sense of what this journal is about. Not always and not 100%, but it'll give you a sense of where this journal is going. The other thing to do is to actually scan a handful of recent publications in the journal, or at least read the title and the abstracts of articles in the most recent issues, last couple of issues, and get a sense of what other people have already published in this journal and see whether your article kind of fits into that family. If your article is not fitting into that family, this might not be the right journal for your article, and you may want to rather go and look somewhere else. For example, if all of the articles that you're reading are quantitative and you've done a qualitative piece of work, that's probably not the right journal for you, and submitting it is likely to result in a desktop rejection, and you don't want to waste your time on that. Rather go and look for a journal that does publish qualitative work. So that's a kind of just a way. You want to try and get a sense of what is this journal looking at, and the aim and scope of the journal is usually not quite enough to give you that information sufficiently strongly. Just a last reminder, if you haven't yet signed the register, please do sign the attendance register. I popped it into the chat again. It's the Google form that it will appear over there on your screen. Point number 8 is about sugar baby journals. I have seen colleagues publish their work repeatedly in the same journal. So they find a journal that they like, that's open to the kind of work that they're doing, or that has a quick turnaround time, or is easy to get through, or something like that. And so they just publish a lot of their work in that same journal. And one should really try to avoid doing that. It undermines the credibility of your CV. When we look through your list of publications and we just see journal A, journal A, journal A, journal A just coming on, like half your publications are all in one journal, it really undermines the credibility of your research profile, even though your work might actually be really good and the review processes of the journals may be really rigorous. Having too many journals in the same, sorry, too many articles in the same journal just undermines the credibility and the appearance of your work. And I've sat on promotion panels, on interviews for employment and the National Research Foundation and funding applications. I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of these over the last several years. And this really does count against you. What you want is you want to spread your eggs in multiple baskets, as we say in English. In other words, you want to use multiple journals. It doesn't mean you can never go back to the same journal more than once, but you do want to make sure that there's a good mix of different journals in your CV for your publications. Yeah, so that's quite a, I mean, that's quite a, I hope quite a simple point, but I'm disturbed. I get disturbed and concerned when I receive people's CVs and I see these repeated uses of the same journal, because I think that you're really compromising your own academic career. Nico's asking a question, is it possible to publish in 2 different journals from the same dissertation? Absolutely. Certainly in terms of sugar baby journals, you would want to do that. So if you're doing a PhD at UJ, we require 4 publications. I would always get my students to go with 4 different journals, not to use the same one at all. And I usually suggest that they go with a local journal first, because they do tend to be a little easier, and I want them to have a good experience of success with their first publication. So usually local, it's just a little easier to get into. It's a smaller pool that you're competing with. And then we start to move internationally and look for more challenging journals where there's a greater chance of their article being rejected. But I want them to have a good, generally at one of them, a good experience first time. So yes, definitely try to go to different journals and not use the same one more than once in your PhD. Amu Kwele, what do you advise should come first, writing an article before finding a journal or finding a journal before writing? They kind of happen simultaneously, but more the second. Find the journal before you start writing too much. Once you have the idea of an article, and you know this, I want to write about this topic, I have this data, I know I've got these kinds of findings, start thinking about where would be a good home for this, and go and find the journal, check what their requirements are in terms of things like word count, referencing style, and so on, and then write your article for that journal. At most, I would say you may have drafted the abstract and introduction, and kind of by that time you want to settle on a journal, and not get much beyond that. The challenge when you write the whole article is that you get to the end of the article and then you realize my article is too long for this journal, and I really want it for this journal. And then you start looking for a journal that meets your article requirements rather than writing your article for a journal. So journal first, then writing as a rule of thumb. All right, point number 9, our second last point, is about page fees. Some journals charge for you to publish your work, and they come under different kinds of names, names like page fees, publication fees, article process charge, or APC. You have to read the journal quite carefully and look for information about fees that get charged. These fees can range very widely from nothing, so a lot of journals don't charge anything, to a few hundred rands to tens of thousands of rands, right? So there's some journals that'll charge 50,000 rand. This quotation here comes from a publication on page fees, and this was the conclusion they reached. We found that The costs for publication range from less than $200. So in South Africa, we times that by what, 25 almost now, per article in modern large-scale publishing forums using post-publication peer review, to about $1,000 per article in prestigious journals with high rejection rates, 90%. Frontiers, so the publishing house called Frontiers, so Frontiers in psychiatry, Frontiers in medicine and public health and so on, they generally charge about 50,000 Rand for your article to be published. And so you want to know that before you go in. Do be aware that there are quite often fee reductions or fee waivers. In other words, they will not charge you if you come from a low to middle income country, so the LMIC. South Africa usually often doesn't fall into that because in Africa, where our sort of financial level that might not feel great is actually kind of middle income. But if you're living in a lower income country, if you're living in Ghana, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, you may well qualify as a low to low middle income country and get a fee waiver. So you want to really look very carefully on your journal website to find that information, and if necessary, engage with the editor, just check out and firm up things before you submit. Otherwise, you may land up with a really big bill. And in South Africa, the amount of money that you may get from the Department of Higher Education for your publication may be less than what you're actually having to pay to get your work published. Now, sometimes that might be worthwhile, and that's, again, a decision that you will make, but make sure that you're going with your eyes wide open. Check with your supervisor, with your head of department, with your librarians around whether the university has special deals. So, for example, with Frontiers, some South African journals, some South African universities have negotiated a deal with Frontiers to get a reduced or a waived, completely, in other words, no charge at all. And so those are sometimes, that's always worth exploring. Jessica's asking, is there a database or list of no-fee journals? Yes, there is. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, Jessica, so I'm going to come to that now. Hang on just for half a minute. Is it always a requirement to publish a journal article under a higher education institution? Masapi, no. No, I think it goes back to the question I answered earlier on where someone said, I'm a teacher at a school, can I publish? And the answer is yes. So it doesn't really matter who you are or where you work. If you have a good piece of research, it can get published. Nobody's really looking at who you are or what qualification you have or where you're based. Your work can be published if your work is good enough. And on the other hand, just because you're a top-level, well-recognized international professor doesn't necessarily mean that your work's going to be accepted. I have lots and lots of articles that are rejected, even though I'm doing quite well in social work in South Africa as a scholar. So it really is about the quality of your work. You're asking, I'm asking in the context of looking at the fees. That's a good point. So we get sometimes with my journal, we'll have people publishing in my journal, and then they'll come to us usually after the event. And I wish they would do it before, to say, I'm not in a university, I don't have access to funding, can I get a fee waiver because of that? And in my journal, we almost always approve that. It's a decision that gets made by our board, not by me as the editor. So I would take it to the board and I would say, here's Masapi, they are not in a university, they're working as a practitioner somewhere, and they've written this nice piece, we've accepted it, we want to publish it, can we waive the page fees? And we've always said yes. So we do, my journal, we would recognize that. I can't speak for other journals. So it's really up to each editor. And what I would suggest that you do is, if you don't have funding for page fees, and there are page fees, is approach the editor in advance to say, what are the options in terms of somebody like me who doesn't have access to funding? I hope that helps clarify. I know these things vary in different contexts. And even in South Africa, in academia, you'll have access to funding to pay the costs of page fees. whereas in another country you might not have, and so you really have to look for open access. And so that takes us on to our last point. We just have a few minutes left, so our timing is spot on. I'm pleased about that. So there is a directory of open access journals, and the website is there on screen. So just jot that down, DOAJ. So the I don't actually know what it stands for, to be quite honest. I'm trying to think. Directory of Open Access Journals, I think is what it stands for, .org. It gives you a really, really nice list of open access journals around the world. And for each journal, it'll tell you whether there is a page fee. And I had a quick sort of scan through, and many, many of them have no page fees. So they're open access, which means that a person wanting to read your publication doesn't have to pay to read it, whereas usually the reader has to pay to read your article. So sometimes you have to pay to publish, and the reader has to pay to read, right? So there's like a double, this is a big money-making racket. But many of the open access journals don't charge page fees, and open access by definition means that readers don't pay to read your work, right? And that, of course, is very desirable because it increases the accessibility of your work. It means that you could go onto their journal website, see an article that you like, download it, read it, and to pay anything. And that's very, very attractive. My journal does charge page fees. They're not horribly expensive, but we do. But our articles are not for free, but they cost, I think, $3 or $4 to download an article. So it's also not very expensive. The other South African journal, Social Maatskaplike Werk, also charges a page fee. So the author has to pay to get their work published, but then the articles are available for free. You don't have to pay to read them. And as I mentioned earlier, sorry, no, I've covered that already, my apologies. So I'm just gathering my thoughts. I want to just come back to the point. So open access definitely increases the accessibility of your work, because someone can just go Google search on Google Scholar, find your article and download it immediately. Whereas if it's in a pay to view, as many journals are, they might not have access to it, particularly if you're not in a university. Even if you are in a university, you might not have great access to those articles. But if it's open access, you see the article, you like it, you download it, you read it, you cite it. And that is a very attractive thing. So I want to go back to that very first article of mine on resilience. That has many citations. I think in part that's because it was a good, well-positioned, relevant article, but I think it's also because I published it in an open access, free to download journal. And so that made it a far more accessible piece of writing. And so if someone's looking to cite something on resilience, they may say, well, I can't afford to download these articles, but I can download Adrian's. And so I'm going to do that. And so open access is a good option. Just remember that not all open access, my brain's a bit tired now. All open access journals will be free for download, but not necessarily free for the author. So you want to check whether you as the author have to pay something for your article. Well, that brings us to the end of today's workshop. We are kind of spot on time. There is a few minutes for any last questions. I'm just keeping a look on the chat. If you have a last question, please type that in. Otherwise, one last request to please complete the attendance register. I would really appreciate that. It will help me and hopefully help you. And I wish you all the best with your writing and hope that you find good and relevant, meaningful homes for your work that you invest in so much. It was really great to spend a bit of time with you this afternoon, and I'll be running some more workshops this year on different topics. And so keep a lookout on wherever it is that you found the link to today. I'll be doing some more over the next few months. So I wish you all have a great rest of your day. Here it's afternoon. I'm going to go and cool down because I'm really hot. Okay, everybody, you take care. Thanks for the thanks in the chats. I appreciate that. You keep well.